Hello and welcome. What we're going to be looking at in today's lesson is the rise of big business. Students will be able to examine causes and consequences of the second industrial revolution, determine how new industry, technology, and business changed the economy, analyze changes as the United States became an industrial society, and review different economic and philosophical ideologies. Terms to know: corporation, monopoly, cartel, John D. Rockefeller, horizontal integration, trust, Andrew Carnegie, vertical integration, social Darwinism, the ICC, Sherman Antitrust Act. So what are corporations? Going into the late 1800s and early 1900s, the United States really starts to see the expansion of corporations used in the United States. This is something that was a very rare concept prior to this time period. Most of the businesses that you see during this time, prior to this, when we look at the Civil War era and previous years, you see a lot of what's referred to as a sole proprietorship. And this is where individual people own their own businesses, and they assumed all liability for anything that happened within that business. And when we look at that, is if you get sued as an individual and you own a sole proprietorship, even if that lawsuit comes through the business that you own, you can lose your own personal assets. So there's a lot of risk involved in having a sole proprietorship and being the only individual who owns that business, and it can really cause a lot of damage to the things that are happening within your life if you're not careful. So what people eventually do is they use a legal concept referred to as a corporation. Corporations are businesses that are owned by multiple people, and really what it does is it limits liability, because since you are incorporating it as its own legal entity, then if that business gets sued, then the only thing that can be lost are the assets of that business. You can't actually lose any personal assets within that concept. So it really limits a lot of people's individual risk, because really the only thing that you can lose with a corporation are the goods and concepts that you have invested into that business. So corporations really help shape American business during this new period because they're able to use a lot of money to fund new technology, to start new industries, and to run large plants across the country. This was due to the large amount of capital, and when we look at what capital is just money that can be invested within a system. So corporations are able to reduce the amount of cost it takes to produce an item because it bought materials in mass amounts and paid workers low wages. So when you're able to buy a lot of goods at the same time, most of the time people are going to cut you a deal because they know that it's guaranteed money. So they're gonna sell you these things at a cheaper rate in order to make sure that they're able to actually keep the flow of goods going. So low cost means that you can produce things cheaper. You've got paid workers, low wages, which means that you can maximize the amount of profit. They're also able to, since they're mass producing these goods and they're able to put goods at a higher rate, it lowers the cost of the good, allowing people to buy more, which would therefore increase how much money that you can make. With all of these things, you've got a lower priced good that's sold, and when you're able to sell these goods at a lower rate and people are able to own more things, it improves the quality of life that people have. It improves the cost of living that people have to deal with in the United States. And that allows them to buy more stuff, which allows them to live, in theory, happier lives. Some corporations try to establish monopolies in order to be able to try and dictate the market within that system. A monopoly is when you only have one business that dominates the entire market for one type of good. And really, this is good for the corporation because what the corporation can do is they can set prices at any level, which means that they can really make as much money as they possibly can by selling those goods at different rates. This is bad for the consumer, though, because if a business can set a price at a very high rate, that means it kind of prices some people out of the market, which, especially if it's a good that looks like it could really improve your life, you want to be able to make sure that you can actually afford the good that exists. The other big issue here is that there's no competition, and this is a bad thing as well because without that competition existing, there's no incentive to improve the product that you possess. The reason why we see iPhones and Androids continually put out new products, the idea behind that is that they are providing you with an improved good, something that they've worked on to make better, to incentivize you to buy that good. And not only are they trying to get you to upgrade and buy a new product that they've released, they're also trying to ensure that you don't buy the competitor's product because, hey, my product is better. Some corporations, in order to try and dominate the market and participate in some of these price-setting concepts, engaged in what is called a cartel. This is when businesses who make the same product mutually agree to sell their goods for a certain price, and this is in order to keep prices high. So if we were to have Coke and Pepsi get together and decide that they're always going to sell every single product that they have at the same rate, then this is them establishing a cartel, and this is them agreeing in order to keep that price high in order to be able to try and maximize their profits. This is illegal and can't happen, because what that is doing is that is a violation of the free market concept. That is a violation of the capitalist idea, and really what that is that's unfair to the consumer, which is why we've made that concept illegal. So beyond just the concept of cartels and corporations, we also have individuals like John D. Rockefeller. And John D. Rockefeller is able to make a lot of deals and become very successful because he owns a lot of land and he's able to produce a lot of oil. So what he does is he makes a deal with the railroads in which they agree to only transport his oil. And he agrees to pay them a fixed rate as far as shipping rates and things like that goes in order to try and price out other companies. This allows him to really take a huge market control and almost establish himself as a monopoly throughout the United States as far as oil that's produced in the country. Something very similar to this happens in the 1990s with Microsoft. And what Microsoft does is they're actually able to take Internet Explorer, which is the built-in web browser for Windows, and they make a deal with all of the computer manufacturers that state that that will be the only web browser that is allowed to be on the computer when it's sold to the consumer. Now, during this time period, the main competitor for Internet Explorer as a web browser was a company called Netscape. And with Netscape not being allowed to be a browser installed within the computer, it really killed the company, because this is well before people sought out things like Chrome or Firefox or web browsers like that. People pretty much used whatever was built in on the computer, and they didn't really seek out to try and download anything new. So with Netscape not being allowed to be on the computer at its sell point, this really killed the entire company, and it was later ruled that Microsoft was a monopoly and all of those deals had to be severed. However, at that point it was already too late for Netscape, and people had become much more comfortable with the use of Internet Explorer at that point. So, standards check. How did corporations change the landscape of American business? Alright, then we look at the concept of integration. Businesses continue to look for ways to cut costs, and that's what businesses do. They want to make as much money as they possibly can, because in a capitalist society, the goal of a business is to make as much money as you possibly can. Some businesses set up what is referred to as horizontal integration. This is when one company tries to buy all of the companies that make the same product. So say Coke wanted to engage in horizontal integration. They would buy Pepsi. They would buy Schneck, which does like 7-Up and things like that. So they would go through and they would buy up all of these soda companies because they're all making the same type of product. But here's the deal with that. A company is not allowed to own the stocks of another company without integrating it into that one company. So what happens is if a company buys stock of another company, they have to integrate it into one name. They have to integrate it into that one company. But what you want to do when you're participating in horizontal integration is you want to avoid the concept that you are setting up a monopoly, because you want to be able to control the market, but you don't want it painfully obvious that you're trying to control the market. So what companies would do is they would create a trust. They would assign a trustee to hold onto that stock for them. And this would combine it into a new organization. So you would control that trustee. You would control that new organization that existed, but it would allow the business to own the stock of another business without doing so illegally, and now you've sort of created a monopoly without creating a monopoly. This eventually becomes illegal as well, because it's still the same thing. You're trying to get around the concept of a monopoly by doing it in a different way, but you still can't do that. Another type of integration that Andrew Carnegie really used with his steel business was vertical integration. Vertical integration is when a business tries to own all of the businesses that exist in order to make that final product. So, Carnegie with steel would have owned the mines that would have gotten the raw materials. He would have owned the transportation companies that would have moved the raw materials from where they were mined to where the factory was. He would have owned the factories that you furnished the stuff into final products. He would have owned the transportation companies that owned or that moved the final product to wherever they were going. So when you own every single aspect of the creation of a product, from the collection of raw materials to the very final product at the end, that's referred to as vertical integration. So as cartels, trusts, and monopolies gained more power, many consumers began to view the practices as unfair. And like we talked about, there are major issues with pricing, there are major issues with quality of goods in the concept of monopolies, trusts, and cartels. Smaller businesses who tried to join the cartels found that they were also being squeezed out of the profits because they didn't have a big enough voice to be able to fight in those arguments. These individuals viewed the leaders of these businesses as robber barons. There were those who, however, who felt that these individuals were leading the nation in creating a better society. These individuals referred to people like Rockefeller and Carnegie as captains of industry. Because despite some of the negative aspects that come out of these companies, Rockefeller really helped the oil industry explode in the United States, and he really helped the expansion of the railroads because of how much money he was pumping into that with the transportation of his oil. And then with Carnegie and his use of steel, it's really him that allows some of the infrastructure in the United States to really take hold, to really kind of flourish. Because without Carnegie Steel, you don't have the huge cities that we have today, like New York and Chicago and things like that. Through this time period, also the idea of social Darwinism began to take hold. So this goes through and takes a different viewpoint on Darwin's view of natural selection. And what Darwin always explained when you look at the concept of biology and natural selection, that concept is that the fittest is going to survive, that whoever has the features that exist for that concept of nature, is that they're the ones that are going to survive, and they're the ones that are going to populate the earth as time moves forward. So what William Graham Sumner stated with social Darwinism is that it was wealth that measured one's inherent value within a society, and those who had more of it were more fit to live in modern society, and those were the ones that would survive, and it would be the poor that would die off, and that it would leave our society stronger. Those who supported a more laissez-faire system of economy celebrate social Darwinism, as it provided them a justification for why government involvement in the economy was not needed. Because what their idea is we are promoting the idea that is the richer that survive and the poor that die off, and therefore we have a stronger society because of it. So because of the feelings that existed within the country and some of the negative aspects that come along with monopolies and things of that nature, the government starts to create things to regulate businesses. And really, these laws didn't exist before this because largely corporations didn't exist. You didn't have a need for it, which is why these types of protections already didn't exist within the country. So in 1887, the government began to step in and reel back some of the power that had been developed by corporations. The U.S. Senate created the Interstate Commerce Commission to oversee all railroad operations. This organization could require railroads to send their records to Congress so that their actions could be monitored for fair practice. But really, that's all that really happened at the beginning. Now, the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission, has grown to have huge power within our society today. They are able to pretty much regulate every single type of business that exists in the United States, with very few exceptions. So it's a very early effort to use this type of oversight really falls short of what's needed and is really unsuccessful at this point. And then in 1890, the Senate passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. This act outlawed the use of any trust that operated in restraining of trade or commerce among the several states. Once again, largely unsuccessful at this time period, but it does begin to show a government movement to try and crack down on unfair business practices in the United States. So last standards check. How did vertical and horizontal integration impact the business practices of America? And how did the U.S. government try to limit the powers of cartels, trusts, and corporations?